I'm glad you guys enjoyed the last video, a Kengan video where I pit Oma against every other fighter in the Annihilation Tournament. But for today's video, we're going to be doing something a little different. For today's video, I'm going to be pitting two of the oldest martial arts in recorded history against each other to see which one is better, to see which one would win in a fight. On one side, Tegoi, the oldest ancestor style of all Japanese martial arts. The direct ancestor of both sumo wrestling and Japanese jujutsu, the martial art that was said to be devised by the god of Kashima, Takemikazuchi no Kami, to defeat the god of Suwa, Takeminakata no Kami, with a single throw from a hand grip. On the other, the precursor to mixed martial arts, the combination of pre-codified boxing and wrestling, and the martial art that allowed for men to dominate seemingly insurmountable odds in unarmed combat, Pankration. For this video, I'll be giving you guys a brief summary of each martial art as best as possible, and then I'll be rating each martial art in 4 categories. Stand-up, ground game, submission, and a final overall score that'll be used to dictate who would win in a fight between two fighters of equal skill and physicality, though we'll also take into consideration training regimes and talent pools for each art to see how likely it would be for both practitioners to actually be on equal footing. To start, Tegoi. So being that Tegoi wasn't a codified system of martial arts, so techniques and forms of the style weren't named or recorded, it's kinda hard to know exactly what the techniques or the training regimes of the style actually were, but by looking at its descendant arts at their earliest stages and what they share in common, it might be easier for us to piece together what Tegoi actually looked like. Its two most major descendant arts are Ancient Sumo and Aiki Jujutsu, one being a primarily striking art, the other being a primarily grappling art. It wouldn't be for quite some time after its inception that sumo became a kumiuchi, or a grappling art, so I imagine the two descendant arts are indicative of a split in Tegoi. We know it has Aiki grappling because that's how Takemikazuchi was described to have beaten Takeminakata, with a soft-style throw from a hand or wrist grip, but it would seem that, while Aiki Jujutsu does have striking, the majority of Tegoi's striking was continued with sumo, with it having only adopted rudimentary grappling, whereas Aiki Jujutsu primarily succeeded Tegoi's grappling skills and only took on the bare minimum striking for the sake of having striking techniques for when necessary and for setting up grips and throws. The reason that's important for us to know is because it likely means that Tegoi was a balanced martial art. That it basically looked like ancient sumo, but with Aiki Jujutsu grappling and throwing techniques. In short, Tegoi would have had a heavy emphasis on close quarters grappling, Aiki redirection and throws, kicks, headbutts, hand strikes, and an emphasis on takedowns for the goal of stomping their opponent to death. For Tegoi's stand-up, I'm giving it a 99 out of 100. It has punches, kicks, and even knee strikes, but also has a plethora of grips to the throat and armpits, the belt, and leg hooks, all with the possibility of mixing and using Aiki in their throws, takedown attempts, and takedown defense. Their striking is diverse and passable, with striking techniques, Sukiwaza, kicking techniques, Kiriwaza, and their boxing techniques, their Kobushi Uchigata, and they also have footwork and evasion skills, their Hazushiwaza, which are good enough to defend against a majority of grappling and striking techniques on a conceptual level. So both offensively and defensively, a Tegoi practitioner is a proficient striker and a more than proficient grappler. Additionally, for their stand-up, they have takedown defense in the form of their Kakewaza, or hooking techniques, which can either be used to prevent a takedown or even to reap a limb for a takedown, and they're heavily proficient in Nagewaza, throwing techniques, and Hiniriwaza, twisting techniques. Their throwing probably wouldn't be as proficient as modern sumo, but it would be much more varied and much more lethal, as things like Kubi Hiniri, or the neck twist, were techniques used in ancient sumo that were removed from grand sumo due to its inherent lethality, as the technique sees the user grab the head of the opponent and then violently twist their body to throw the opponent by their head, putting immense pressure on the neck and increasing the likelihood of the opponent getting spiked onto their misaligned neck, which could lead to paralysis or instant death. Even the ancient sumo techniques that carried on into Grand Sumo, like the Saba Ori or the Yagura Nagi, would be more effective or difficult to defend against from a Tegoi practitioner because, on top of those techniques already being quite effective, the Tegoi practitioner would also be able to apply Aiki to those techniques, manipulating the kinetic energy of each technique to make it considerably more difficult to resist. For ground game, I'm giving Tegoi, the origin martial art for Jujutsu, an 82. The newaza in Jujutsu is quite exceptional, and one of the things Jigoro-sensei did to streamline Jujutsu into Judo was remove an ocean's worth of lethal techniques. Now, that was nearly 2,000 years after Tegoi became Jujutsu, so it's impossible to know what was a carryover from Tegoi and what was created in Jujutsu, but Daito Ryu Aki Jujutsu has had some pretty exceptional ground game techniques for about 1,200 years, so suffice it to say that, while this is speculation, like a lot of discussion about Tegoi, I think it's reasonable to believe that Tegoi had some pretty good ground game, especially since ancient sumo, which had almost completely abandoned ground fighting in favor of either mounting your opponent and beating them to death or stomping them to death, had a plethora of submissions that were likely carryovers from Tegoi. Speaking of submissions, I'll give Tegoi a 91. In the Kakutogi no Rikishi, a Japanese history book about martial arts, ancient sumo is said to have had shimewaza, chokes and strangulation techniques, as well as kansetsu waza, or joint locking techniques. The martial art that, of the two main descendant arts of Tegoi, focused more on standing grappling and striking, and it still had chokes and locks. Even its sibling art, Daito Ryu, is basically half chokes and submissions, so it's likely that Tegoi had some exceptional finishers to complement its takedowns and wrestling skills. For Pankration, it was formally introduced as an Olympic competition in 648 BC, making it over 600 years older than ancient sumo, but was also likely practiced at around the same time as Tegoi. Most people think it was simply a fusion of boxing and wrestling, but not only was it more of a blend of the two, where Pankratiasts would learn how to mix their striking and grappling together, but it also had kicks, holds, joint locks, chokes, and ground fighting. It was also, to my knowledge, the first real codification of boxing and wrestling techniques, the first time techniques were recorded into a system. Jumping right into the scoring for Pankration, I'll give its stand-up, its Ano Pankration, an 89. Their stances were very good for switching between boxing and wrestling, as to be expected of what's essentially a hybrid of boxing and wrestling. They were proficient in boxing techniques. Pankration, ironically enough, also places as much of an emphasis on kicking as ancient sumo does, with Nomino Sukune, the founder of sumo, winning his first fight with almost exclusively kicks, and Pankration believing kicks were so integral to being a good fighter that a compliment to a pancreatist was essentially, "You kick great," and while I honestly found Pankration's boxing lacking, its wrestling more than makes up for it. It has hip tosses, suplexes, and even reversal throws from a takedown sprawl, not only indicating good takedown techniques, but also good takedown defense as well. It's also worth noting that these were all more lethal versions of what we see today, most of them being spikes onto the head. That emphasis on takedowns and takedown defense, as well as the chokes and submissions I'll discuss later, and the apparent wrestling skills of pancreatists leads me to give its Kato Pankration, its ground fighting, a 92. Finally, submissions. I personally think that few martial arts, codified or not, can hold a candle to Pankration's submissions. Both standing and on the ground, while some of the specific techniques and how you get to them are a bit strange, a bit odd, and or a bit niche, rather than that being indicative of there being a lot of useless submissions, it shows instead that pancreatists had submissions for literally every possible position. They had positions to lock shoulders, lock elbows, lock both arms at once or a single arm, there were leg locks like ankle locks and heel hooks, and while a lot of their chokes were on the more basic side, relying often on the basic murder choke position and applying pressure with the fingers differently as they did so, they also, of course, had the rear naked choke, one of the most effective choking techniques ever, though that may also be a point to Tegoi, as the name of the technique that we use nowadays is from Jujutsu, Tegoi's descendant art, meaning it's just as likely that Tegoi created the rear naked choke as Pankration, with it also being distinctly possible that both arts invented the technique separate from each other. Overall, I give Pankration a 93 for its submissions. Truly a work of art. So, for their comparisons, in the stand-up, Tegoi is at a 99 versus Pankration's 89. In terms of boxing, I was quite surprised to find that ancient sumo seems to have better hand strikes, that the vast majority of techniques that were outright removed from sumo as it transitioned from death battles to sport were its Tsukiwaza and Kobushi Uchigata. For ancient sumo to have that extensive fist forms right out of the gate, that had to have meant that its predecessor had incredible boxing, which is ironic as I couldn't find much about Pankration's boxing itself. Obviously it had to be good, as the codified boxing in Pankration would later become the basis for the sport of boxing that we see today, but it certainly didn't rise to the level of having multiple different categories of hand strikes within an overall hand striking system as ancient sumo and likely Tegoi had. For kicking, it would seem that they're about equal. Pankration won in technique, as it had a vast array of different kicking techniques and also even strategies, tactics, and counters to apply with them, but Tegoi had just as many different kicks and won out with power, with the founder of ancient sumo, Nomina Sukune, completely shattering his opponent's bones with his kicks. His opponent being Taima no Kehaya, a man who is said to be able to kick as fast as the wind and shatter stone lanterns with his shins and feet. They also stuck to pretty much only one kicking tactic, but went about it in many different ways due to the end result's peerless reliability. Their kicks were drive-in stamp kicks to knock the other fighter down so that they could be stomped to death. Again, assuming that the first ever sumo match is indicative of what Tegoi looked like, being that Tegoi is sumo's ancestor, I'd say that Tegoi and Pankration should be equal in kicks, a rare feat for both arts in the ancient world. For miscellaneous striking, Pankration used elbows and knees and likely butted as well, and ancient sumo, and by extension Tegoi, had a focus on knees and butting while also featuring unorthodox strikes like forearm strikes, kachiage, and so on. So again, they're about equal. Finally, for footwork, while Pankration had a great stance that allowed for it to utilize its boxing footwork and wrestling footwork, both were proto-modern ancestors of the refined, hyper-focused, and individual versions we see today. Boxing and wrestling have such good footwork because they focus on footwork for only boxing or only wrestling, and they've evolved their footwork for hundreds of years. Pankration had an unrefined, blended version of both that also had to incorporate kicking, whereas not only did Tegoi not have a set stance to my knowledge, but it had an entire system of dodging and evasion techniques in the form of Hazushi, for grappling, throwing, and takedowns. Across the board, I'd give it to Pankration due to Pankration having more grips to different parts of the body, more positions, and more throws and takedowns that I could find, as well as takedown defense, which shows how dominant takedowns were, so much so that they needed to devise a system of defense against it. But that said, unfortunately for Pankration, I don't think it has an answer for Aki Inyo. The concept of Aiki is so foreign and antithetical to everything in Pankration that not only would they have no defense against it, but none of their takedowns or throws would work against it, nor would any of their counters. That's the main reason why I give Tegoi such a high stand-up score. Ancient Sumo showed us that it has grappling similar enough and nearly as proficient as Pankration, but Tegoi also has a secret weapon in Aki that doesn't just bump it up to equal to Pankration, it allows Tegoi to far surpass it. Aiki. A technique so powerful, the people of Japan thought it was powerful enough for a god to defeat another god with it in a single use. For ground grappling, it's Tegoi's 82 to Pankration's 92. In a complete flip of stand-up, it's now Pankration with a whopping 10-point advantage, and it really makes sense when you think about it. Daito Ryu Aki Jujutsu has a fairly extensive Newaza system, but Ancient Sumo barely has any ground grappling at all other than basics like pinning and mounts, so it's impossible to know which is closer to its ancestor art or how much of each style is uniquely its own. If I had to guess, being that Jujutsu is a wartime martial art, a type of martial art where you don't want to spend too much time stationary on the ground due to the threat of a secondary opponent attacking you with a weapon while you're grounded, and being that, even after being adopted by the Japanese military and becoming a kumiuchi, a wrestling art, in the 8th century, sumo still never really had any ground game, it's likely that Tegoi didn't have any grade A ground grappling itself. It's certainly worthy of B tier at least, by virtue of likely being the root of some of Jujutsu's ground grappling and having standing grappling techniques that can apply just as well while grounded, but it wouldn't compare well against Pankration that was primarily used for one-on-one fights where ground grappling excels. I've been told before that Pankration was used in wars, but even so, I highly doubt that the wrestling and ground grappling techniques you'd see in a one-on-one competition were the same techniques you'd see on a battlefield, or else there'd be nobody left alive to pass down Pankration. Finally, while Tegoi's Aiki and Jujutsu Descendant point to it being a savant art for submissions, both standing and grounded, Pankration's refinement and mastery of so many different positions for locks and chokes gives them the slight edge, a 93 to Tegoi's 91. While Tegoi likely had some downright astonishing submissions, Pankration had such a focus on ground grappling and wrestling, a much larger one than Tegoi as indicated by the 10-point lead it has, that they needed a massive amount of different submissions to go for while ground grappling. It's also likely that Tegoi focused on wrist locks chiefly, while Pankration is more diverse. Tegoi likely had ankle picks and heel locks and ankle locks and knee bars and elbow or shoulder locks and even neck locks, but Pankration likely has more of each and has worked and practiced them more often. Tegoi likely never really needed ground grappling or grounded submissions, as it could always finish the fight in the stand-up with a wrist lock or aikinage, whereas Pankration is definitely more of a jack of all trades. Finally, for overall scores, Tegoi stands at a nearly A-tier 88 points, but Pankration takes the win at 93 points, A-tier. Perhaps if there was more information I could find on Tegoi, it would have scored higher, but the same could be said for Pankration, honestly. Pankration has more information available due to its being codified, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we have all the information necessary to accurately score something like this. As far as how likely it would be for a Tegoi practitioner to meet his physical equal in a Pankratiast, if we consider that ancient sumo fighters were likely a good representation of later Tegoi practitioners, the odds are good. Sumotori packed on weight even back then, but not nearly as much as some sumo matches would go on for days, so they had to have the stamina to continue fighting, so the Sumotori would likely have the weight and power advantage, but the Pankratiast will have likely fought dozens of more battles than the Tegoi boy, winning on experience and technique. That's just my take though. Let me know what you guys think down below. Who do you think would win, Tegoi or Pankration? Do you think I accurately represented each style's abilities? If not, why? Also, let me know if you guys enjoyed the video by leaving a like on the video, and subscribe to the channel if you're looking forward to more content like this, as I certainly plan to do more. Thank you all so much for watching, I've been Red Fox, and I'll see you all next time. Peace.